Good morning. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Nevis Murray. I'm the Chief Executive of Suicide Prevention Australia. Welcome to today's very special discussion between you, our members, and Australia's National Suicide Prevention Advisor. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the original people of the lands that you meet. We recognise their contribution and connection to land, water and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We also remember those we've lost to suicide and acknowledge that the voice of people with lived experience is critical and essential to our work. Thanks to each of you for joining us from right around the country today. Today brings a very important opportunity to link in with one of Australia's most influential figures. When the Prime Minister appointed Christine Morgan as National Suicide Prevention Advisor in 2019, SPA hailed this as a watershed moment in our nation's history. Suicide Prevention Australia has been calling for a whole-of-government approach to suicide prevention for some years, and Ms Morgan has brought exactly that to the table. The appointment of a National Suicide Prevention Advisor has quite simply brought to our sector a whole new level of oversight, coordination and direction. We've seen just how important that coordination role is over the past few months in particular. It's very timely then that the prime focus today will be to hear from and ask questions about the National Suicide Prevention Advisor's ongoing work. We invite you to ask questions about the key themes of her recent interim report, including whole-of-government reform, priority populations, how we might better align services and programs, the role of data, evidence and quality, and fostering a consistent model of care for suicide prevention. We'll also have the opportunity in the final 30 minutes of the forum to engage with Christine about her role in the COVID-19 response and how the sector is responding during this very challenging time. I'll invite you, if you've not already done so, to visit Slido via your phone so that you can make questions and comments throughout today's proceedings. We know that long-term, systemic change is the best way to reverse the tide of distress. Today is a terrific opportunity to engage with the person who is brokering much of that change. I'll now hand over to one of Australia's busiest women, National Suicide Prevention Advisor Christine Morgan. Christine's discussion with you will be moderated by our Director of Policy and Advocacy, Rebecca Burdick-Davis. I look forward to hearing your discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nevis, and thank you again, Christine, for taking the time out of your incredibly busy diary to get involved in our forum discussions today. And just a quick reminder for our members, if you'd like to contribute a question or comment over the next hour and a half, you can do that under the hashtag SPAForum on Slido. Christine, I wonder if you could perhaps open our discussion today maybe with some observations drawn from your past 10 months as National Suicide Prevention Advisor. I know you've been incredibly busy, as I said.
Thank you, Rebecca. And firstly, can I say how much I welcome this opportunity to take time to actually continue our public conversation, because I think that's very much how the task force and I have been looking at doing the work we have over the last 10 months, which is to really have a public conversation about how we can improve the way in which we approach all issues around suicide prevention. But Rebecca, I would like to just start by acknowledging both the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, but also to pay my respects and to remember very specially those who we have lost to suicide, those who have been touched by suicide. It is something that, as we know, touches so many Australians, and to have you with us today means you have a very keen interest in this. So thank you for your interest. Thank you to those who are doing so much. I think one of the things that I've observed, Rebecca, over the last 10 months is how committed people in this sector are, how much people are doing. We have a lot to learn. We have opportunities to do things differently and hopefully in a way that will help us reduce not just the number we lose to suicide, but those for whom it becomes a crisis. But I just want to pay respects to those. So that's probably my first observation. So over that 10 months, coming within terms of reference which really are quite broad. Those terms of reference in the simple sense do something that, with thanks to SPA and so many of you, has been an advocacy point for so long, which is how do we move from what is really a medicalised model about intervention to try and reduce suicide to a more whole of government approach. That has been on the table for so long. One of those things that's so easy to say, but if you start to unbundle it, what does it actually mean? And I think that's one of our challenges. So the terms of reference certainly embrace that, and we know that the Prime Minister has taken this on himself because he does understand that very critical point that a health minister is well placed to influence his or her colleagues. A First Minister, a Prime Minister, can require. And if we're really going to shift the dial, I think that's probably important. We had the opportunity following a summit which we held in November, which brought together over 100 Australians to look at this through the lens of not just what we do within health, but more broadly. Following that, to actually make some initial findings. And those initial findings, we couched actually quite deliberately in the form of an overarching observations, together with what we called in-principle recommendations. Now, why did we do that? We did them in-principle recommendations quite early in the piece, really to start and further the conversation around what should our approach be. We're very conscious of the fact that this appointment is for 18 months. We're hurtling towards December this year. We want to make a difference, so those recommendations are in there as small r recommendations to stimulate our thinking. So we welcome back any comments on it. Where do we actually get to with those initial findings? I think the most fundamental thing that we felt as a task force, I certainly felt it very strongly, was that we know, all of us know, that approximately 50% of those people we lose to suicide, and we have to also assume within our attempts, have never been in touch with the mental health services. So we can't just wait for people to come to us. So I think the overriding paradigm shift was to say, let's move to an assertive outreach approach. Then we also looked at it and said, what's really interesting here, and I own this, that when we measure what is happening in terms of people we lose, that's not only a tragic statistic, it's one-dimensional. And so one of the things we are particularly concerned to do is to really bring front and centre our lived experience, to better understand what is it that takes somebody down the pathway, suicide ideation, through to suicidal crisis, through to attempt. If we can better understand that, understand what the journeys have been, understand what has worked for somebody, understand what has bugged the bejesus out of somebody, we will be better informed. They were two really key paradigm shifts we wanted. We looked at 6 priority areas. We looked firstly at not whether we need a whole of government approach, we know we do. What does that actually mean? How do we bring that together? We looked at the criticality of early distress intervention. So rather than waiting for a crisis, how do we go? And how do we use various government and community touch points to really try and touch people at points of vulnerability? We looked at the fact that you can't treat this in a homogenous way. We are individual people, we have individual needs, and we need targeted approaches for particular groups of vulnerability and particular individuals. We need to sharpen our health response so that it is more integrated. I mentioned at the beginning of my comments that there is so much activity going on. We have quite a lot of opportunity to better coordinate that and to try and make that more effective. Our 5th area was the critical component of carers and families, and looking at how we support carers and families and friends from get-go right through our experiences of suicide ideation and suicide. And then finally, the criticality of data and evidence. We must do that. Key work we're doing, just to finish before we kind of get into a bit more of a conversation, is we are front and centre about our consultation with people with lived experience. What we want to better understand, if we can, in a very short period of time, but we can start this work, is to do some journey mapping. What actually has been the reality for people, and then to do a bit of a thematic analysis. Can we from that start to pick up what could be some key indicators for us? Secondly, Australia doesn't have a model of suicide, and that in and of itself would really start to bring systemically and in a community sense our efforts into a more coordinated space. And thirdly, we're doing what we would call our strategic plat. The plat has 3 strands. So we've put in there health, Indigenous and whole of government. The health, we somehow need to master our federated model of government and say how can we bring the various plans that are sitting at a Commonwealth level, at a jurisdictional level, into something which is more effective. We are working with Guy Dewey to bring together a suicide prevention plan with an Indigenous lens, which aligns to the other work we're doing. And then thirdly, applying our suicide model, how can we actually go into different portfolios across government? And we're interested in a number of sections there to say, let's identify the touch points. Let's not take a whole of welfare approach, but let's take a suicide prevention approach and let's put together a strategy as to how we can do it whole of government. So that's just a few things we're doing this year.
Just a few things indeed. Well, thank you so much for that framing, Christine, because it really ties quite nicely into some of the questions that we've started to see streaming in. And there were 2 things that you mentioned just then, one of which was that your 18-month term is quickly coming to the finish line. And then secondly, that you're looking at, I guess, whole of government architecture, I guess you could say, that you want to leave in place. Do you have any early thoughts about what that might look like, or are there models that you're turning to internationally to inform that approach?
So this whole concept of modelling, so this must go back to my early days of being a lawyer, you know, where can we just get some order out of this?
Yes.
So one of the questions that I asked Dr. Jaylee Skeen, and I'd like to pay tribute to Jaylee, I know that she's with us today, but to Jaylee and the whole of the team who are doing so much work on the task force, is to say, how can we look at this from a whole of government approach? What is happening overseas? Now, one of the challenges we have, of course, is that there are no 2 countries really which have the same constitutional makeup as to what works. So we need to put this in a context of what is our federated model in Australia. We need a model around suicide. Now, we have theories of suicide, as we know. We have some evidence-based interventions, but that actual piece of work to say, if you were looking at this at a systemic framework and you wanted to identify what are the mandatory critical components, how do you bring in everything in a coordinated way, that's the piece of work that we are really trying to do. And I think that if there is one legacy piece that we could do, that's what we are really committed to trying to do.
Well, I know that's music to our ears here at SPA. Whole of government reform is an agenda that we've been pursuing for some years, so it's just terrific to see you, I guess, creating that change in your role as National Suicide Prevention Advisor. Just talking about, I guess, whole of government taking in, I guess, an entire life cycle approach or a life cycle approach to suicide prevention. We have a question from Karen Phillips at Standby that really links nicely with that. And Karen has said, currently there's a need for universal postvention responses. How can we advocate for proactive whole of government measures that take this in, so that incorporate postvention?
Incorporate postvention. Karen, thank you for that comment, because nobody can argue with you. It is absolutely critical, and I think one of the observations we have had over the last 10 months is we are too truncated in what we look at with suicide prevention. We look at it perhaps in terms of when we intervene. That would be one thing, rather than going upstream and looking to what are the early indicators of distress or stresses which we need to look at. We look at suicidal crisis. We look at suicidal attempt. We look at losing someone to suicide. We must extend out. We must look at our postvention area. We need to be better placed to understand if there's a potential cluster impact, but importantly we also need to understand the impact of suicide on families, friends, communities, and actually how we look at that in and of itself. As we well know, postvention can come back into the prevention space. So without postvention in a universal and targeted way, we actually don't complete that circle. So it's critical.
Great. I'm sure that Karen will be very pleased with that response. And I do note that that $64 million package, suicide prevention package that you announced earlier on this year, incorporated significant funding to...
It did, to Standby, yes,
yep,
so that we could do that. So I think that, and thank you for mentioning that, Rebecca, because I think that that actually gave the task force and I a little bit of a boost, because that particular package of $64 million, I think, did hear the fact that we needed to pivot out into an assertive outreach and a more comprehensive approach. So whilst it was funded from health, it was about how can we reach out and how can we expand that reach to include things, as you say, such as postvention.
Terrific. We now have a few questions that are coming in around priority populations, which I know is another major theme in your interim report, and one that we've found really interesting to grapple with because it's so complex and there's so many different distinctive needs among those groups. We have an anonymous question here around what is your approach to targeting suicide prevention to priority populations, for example, LGBTQI, veterans, young people, CALD communities. It's quite a broad one. It's
a really broad one, isn't it? And I think, firstly, my comment is to say we need to, and this is hopefully where the suicide model will help us, we need to understand the common denominators. What are the common denominators that touch our very humanity? So irrespective of the group within which we may or may not come, there are some underpinning points which touch our humanity, which touch the way we need to be approached. Particularly, for instance, I absolutely unashamedly have a call out for increased compassion for all of us as we go through this. Then we need to look at the fact that as we try to unbundle the complexity of having a system approach to address distress which can lead to suicide, which is as individual as who we are, and we know we can't really predict who this is going to happen for. What we do know is we can look at particular groupings of stresses. So I think my first approach to it is to try to better understand those things which would define somebody coming within that group. So if we took, for instance, our CALD population, then the common denominators are to say our common humanity, our common stresses, but there are particular challenges that would be coming from somebody who is culturally or linguistically diverse in Australia still. And those touch points would be both within the culture in and of itself, so some particular challenges perhaps or barriers, but also in how that then blends in with our society. Simple things such as language and translating it, and how do I, if I am of a different culture and a different language and English is not my first language, how do I even communicate some of this to somebody if I have to do it through a translator? That's right. A challenge. I take our Indigenous population. That in and of itself, we have to be very careful we don't just homogenise it into Indigenous. It has its subgroups, it has its youth, it has its elders, it has its men. So I think it is taking the lens and looking at another one which has received quite a lot of focus is our veterans.
Yes, and that's right, with the Royal...
With the appointment there of a Veteran Suicide Commission, which I think I totally welcome, because I say that one of the things that can come out of this role is to look at that overarching umbrella we take. But then there will be specific needs for all of these. And our veterans' journey starts when they join the ADF. So it's how do we look at that journey of joining and the fact that serving members of our ADF have a significantly reduced rate of suicide, and yet it escalates when they leave the service and become vets. So what are the particular stresses for them? What are those issues about transitioning into a life which is not as a serving person, serving personnel, but also particular stresses around sort of some of, not just the transitional bits, but maybe some of the things they have experienced that they've had to carry forward. So again, it's really trying to look in a targeted way as to how can we treat people respectfully as individuals, but group them with our LGBTQI plus community. What are the particular challenges? And we may find with our LGBTQI plus community that the challenges in 2020 may be different in 2025. I hope they are, but they will still be challenges. So how do we bring that into play?
I guess going back to the whole topic of veteran suicide, I wonder, how do you intend to work with the Veteran Suicide Commissioner once they're appointed? Do you expect that you'll be working really closely or separately? How do you see that
So firstly, I think the one thing we won't want to do is to duplicate each other. That is absolutely not. This is such a big area. So will we be in regular communication? Absolutely. In fact, I would welcome the opportunity to meet with that person on a very regular basis to share what we're doing. Secondly, we would certainly invite somebody from their team to be sitting with us within our structure. So we have an expert advisory group, as some of you may know, as well as an interdepartmental committee that's more on the government side. So we would certainly welcome somebody to come in to understand what we're doing, to share with us their particular needs, but for us to also share with them. So I think it's about understanding that there will be, if you like, that classic Venn diagram of the subset, which will be our common area, and then the areas we're working on with each other.
Yes, well that's wonderful. I think it's always good to hear that our senior policymakers are working together and not, as you said, duplicating effort. I think we anticipated that response, but it was great to have it for our members. We have a couple of questions that have come through about young people, and I guess particularly right now we know that young people are experiencing a myriad of different life pressures.
Absolutely.
Laura from your town has asked, have you looked into ways to best support children and young people in the prevention of suicide, and how might you do this at the national level? I'm guessing it would be similar to the response that you've given around other priority groups.
That is. So look, very good question, and again, not a simple answer, because when you look at children and young people, you've got within there a few different issues. So what age groups do we talk about? If you go into health systems in the jurisdictions, then we effectively have child and adolescence, which really goes through till about 18. If you go from a Commonwealth perspective, you've got a youth-based approach which goes through to 25. So that's just a context thing. How do we set that? How do we address the particular challenges of different groups of young people? And I think a lot of those do relate to increased anxiety around potentially global issues, around climate. I think there's a lot of concern around our geopolitical space and what is shifting there. I think a sense of security has shifted certainly from when I was a young person. But embedded in your question also is another really important group, and that is children. And this is one area where we must adopt a whole of government in the sense of cross-jurisdictional, because children who die by suicide is a tragedy upon tragedy. And we know from the reports of our child commissioners in a number of the states that we have children, particularly children at risk who may be in state care, who we are losing. That is absolutely not okay. Nobody accepts that that is okay. So when you ask what can we do at a Commonwealth level, then we've kind of got some challenges in touch points, because of course out-of-home care for children and those issues are a jurisdictional one. If we don't take a Commonwealth approach but rather take a national approach, which is how do we bring our federal play into action, then we might be able to do something. So we are certainly through our what we're calling our whole of government team approach, looking not just at Commonwealth portfolios, but we're looking at issues such as children at risk, our prison populations. They're incredibly at risk, people who are homeless. How can we go down into the jurisdictions?
And how are you finding, just quickly working with the jurisdictions, are you finding that they're very open to having these discussions with you too?
Very much so. Very much so. Look, I think, and this is another thing that gives me a boost. I said one of the boosts was the fact that the funding package recognised the need to go external. The other thing which absolutely energises Jaylee and the team and myself is the fact that this is an issue that seems to be of real concern for so many Australians, including our governments and including our departments. And we have had some fantastic opportunities to interact. We all want to find the challenges. I think the conversation we're having is, this is actually not easy to do. So actually we need our collective wisdom and our collective expertise to do it.
Terrific. We have one final question, I guess, under the priority population space, but it's not really a question about a priority group, but about a group of people, particularly in the suicide, tragic suicide statistics that we see that are overrepresented, and that's men.
Yes.
We've had a question here which is anonymous. What avenues or awareness campaigns are being considered to engage men as participants and trainers in suicide prevention or intervention? Are you looking at male suicide as a specific, I guess,
Absolutely,
topic
yes.
in and of itself?
Yeah, so I'm hearing in that probably two things. One is, are we looking at men as a vulnerable group? Absolutely, absolutely. Whichever way you look at this, that is where we have our high rates. So
Yes.
we certainly are looking at that. But I think embedded in that also is, are we going to be using men to be engaged in that? And I'm going to take that out a little bit further and say, what is the role of peer workers? What is the role of lived experience? Critical, absolutely critical. Because if one of the underpinning assumptions that goes with suicide prevention is you must ensure that you are connecting with people, because connection provides hope, and hope is a fundamental component for suicide prevention, then you must be able to bring in people who can resonate with others. Peer workers, lived experience is critical in that. The needs of our men, again, are particularly challenging. I think we need to take that and we need to look at it through the lens of age groups within our men. We need to look at particular cultural issues, and we need to look at challenges around issues such as employment, financial crisis and identity. So there are very specific vulnerabilities for men. I think also one of the challenges for men is that ability to reach out and seek help. And again, that is where men working with men is indisputably a path that we need to include in our whole toolkit.
Fantastic. I think we have some more questions around priority groups that we might respond to in writing, and I should remind people, if you want to submit a question or a comment, you can use the hashtag SPA Forum on Slido, and if we haven't got the opportunity to get to your question today because of time, we'll be responding to you in writing within the next couple of days, so you won't miss out. So the next question we have for you, Christine, is from Grace Amber at Second Steps. And Grace was really interested, I guess, talking about service and program alignment. What is being done to ensure uniformity of intake criteria into state government mental health services? I wonder if you can talk about this, given the issues with federated model.
Thank you.
A thorny one.
Because there are, well, of course, the starting point with this is that we have different jurisdictions with different models and different care. So I think that there's two ways I'd like to answer this. As we go down the path of exploring and articulating our suicide model, one of the takeouts from that is that we have clarity around the criteria we do need to be looking at. I think that is absolutely critical. That is something that we can then share. There is, of course, then the challenges to how that criteria translates into service models, service designs, service deliveries and programs. Really, we can't control that. So I think that all we can do is seek to influence it in terms of those components which are critical. The second thing, though, that I'd like to look at this for is that whilst there is value in uniformity, because that ensures that we have a collective and focused understanding of what we're looking for, I'd also like to balance that with a no wrong door approach, because, as I say, we are dealing in everything we do with the reality of ourselves as individuals, and we all have different challenges, different ways of trying to communicate and reach out for help and to enter services and programs. So I think that would probably distill down into a kind of hybrid answer, Grace, which is that we need clarity of criteria that we're looking at, but we need a breadth of different entry points so that we broaden the openings for anybody to come into the system and services and programs.
Thanks, Christine. I think it would be interesting to explore upstream what that collaboration with the jurisdictions might look like, and I wonder what you think around the role of funding. I don't want to say as a carrot and stick approach, but in reality that's perhaps how it looks. But what's the role in funding arrangements between the Commonwealth and the jurisdictions, and how could they perhaps be used to better align services and programs? Is that something you're considering?
How long do we have? How long do we have? This is a big issue that I think when we're looking at actually not only through the lens of suicide prevention, but the whole of our mental health system, and the reality that, and maybe it's worth just restating this, the reality that we have for our mental health system and therefore for our suicide prevention system, which comes predominantly from this, is that we have three components to it. We have our primary care, our tertiary care and our community-based care. And community-based care is where 85–90% of what we do needs to be done. Our primary care is funded by the Commonwealth, our tertiary care is funded by the jurisdictions, our community care is shared. But there is no underpinning foundational piece there that helps us understand what are the essential components of what we should be delivering in community-based care, whether for mental health or suicide prevention, and who should be paying for that. So that's our first challenge. Our second challenge is our current funding mechanisms, which are really block funding or grant funding or an MBS rebatable kind of rebate insurance kind of system. In conversations with the Productivity Commission and with other stakeholders, when we're really trying to look at this issue of funding, I think that there's a couple of things. Firstly, there's a recognition that we probably aren't doing it efficiently or effectively at the moment. And we have very much an expenditure-based model. We look at how much does it cost to look after someone, as distinct from an investment model of how much are we prepared to invest in somebody to keep them well. And I think that's a big shift we can look at. Secondly, is that if you take the approach that actually what we're wanting here is effective outcomes for people, then the starting point is not so much the funding. The starting point is the outcome, and then the service design, and then what is the funding mechanism that sits behind that will drive the outcome you need. So it's quite a fundamental shift we need to do. It's quite a complex one. I think we are well placed at the moment to be looking at this. I think there is an appetite for reform for our system. The system's not broken, but the system can be improved. And I think this underpinning funding mechanism is very much one that we could and should look at. And let's face it, the more efficient we spend the dollars, the more dollars there will be there to shift to that investment kind of approach. So there's a lot going for us to do this. But again, the interesting thing with this is whilst we need our expertise from suicide prevention, because we need to understand the outcomes we want, we actually need our financial heads. We need our economists.
Yes.
We need our hardcore business skills to drive a lot of this as well.
I think you make an interesting point there around the role of the Productivity Commission in all of that, in all of these considerations around funding. And I can share that we at Suicide Prevention Australia have certainly received a few calls from the PC asking around funding and I guess the cost of suicide, and the draft report of the Productivity Commission certainly started to capture what that might look like in the billions of dollars. I guess we're seeing some other questions come in around that whole area of funding, intergovernmental collaboration. And James Bell from Wesley Mission is actually going down more at that grassroots level. James is interested to know what your engagement with local government has looked like, or the engagement of the task force with local government has looked like. And he's also made a comment, local government is a key provider, particularly in remote and regional areas.
Yep.
People love this government collaboration piece.
Don't they? Hi, James, and hi to everybody at Wesley. I don't know that people know, but I used to work at Wesley, and Lifeforce was one of the programs I was heavily involved in. James, great question. Great question, because there are those three tiers of government, Commonwealth, state, territory, and local. And if we want to really look at a whole of government approach, we must include local. Secondly, and probably very critically, is the fact that we are looking at all of the responses we're doing through a community-based lens. One of the themes that has just emerged so strongly over the last 10 months and has been reinforced through our bushfires, and interestingly in a kind of covert way through the COVID-19 response, has been we do rely on each other, we do need each other, and an effective response to suicide prevention is through the community lens. Now, if you go through the community lens, if you go through enabling, empowering communities, you are right in there with local government. So we have certainly been in engagement with our local governments association and services, and we are proactively looking at how do we unlock the potential to work with that level of government and with community to make that a reality. How can we actually get that strengthening on the ground?
At the grassroots level, is it the PHNs that perhaps have those relationships and then upstream intelligence to yourself? How is that sort of working, I guess?
Look, it's interesting. So if you take your local communities, they of course don't necessarily know federal or state boundaries. They're just a local community that will have a touch point with a Commonwealth initiative, the primary health networks, or with a state-based initiative, a local health district or a local health area. So one of the complexities is actually working out who are those stakeholders for that local community. And quite a good way to group a local community is around a local council kind of concept. So it is about how you then bring the different lenses together and actually unlock resources and services and pathways. At the end of the day, that's the other complexity here where it's so important, is that you need to have pathways for people through all the different parts of our system. And so doing that from a local level is probably your best starting point.
We have some questions coming in that aren't perhaps within scope of our agenda, but very much on the topic of research, which is certainly an area that Suicide Prevention Australia is passionate about, and we've been administering a significant program for government over the past few years in that space. Nikki Jameson is a PhD candidate in suicide prevention research, and I think was also a recipient under that grant scheme that we administer. And she's asked, I'm interested in the research agenda moving forward. What specific areas of suicide research will be the government's priority focus? This might be a difficult one to respond to, given...
It's a difficult one to give a specific answer to at the moment. It's not a difficult one to answer, Nikki, in terms of what we're doing. There's a couple of things that are happening. Firstly, in a broader space which goes back into our mental health space, the National Mental Health Commission has been asked as one of the implementation activities under our 5th National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan to bring together a national mental health research strategy. So we have a broad engagement right across research in all aspects. And in fact, we had a workshop at the beginning of this year, again, with over 100 people at it that contributed to that. Suicide prevention is a key component of that. And what we're trying to look at through that strategy is through a principles-based framework approach. How do you guide that very decision-making about what are the priorities for research in any given time? So we know the broad areas we would want to cover, and we know the importance of translational outcomes, that is really critical. But research across the spectrum is really important. So I don't believe it is necessarily for some entity like the government to actually do a top-down of these are things we think important. I think it's got to be, again, a very informed program that is taken on and informed collaboration around those priorities, but we need a principles-based framework to determine it. So that's what we're doing from the Commission perspective. I applaud, absolutely applaud what SPA is doing through its research fund. I think that is fantastic, and particularly in enabling researchers to develop and grow in those areas. So I think all research is fantastic, all research is critical. It's about how we bring it together and how we coordinate the outcomes of it and identify those gaps we need. One thing I will say that is a glaring gap, and it's a gap across mental health research, not just suicide prevention, is how best to incorporate lived experience. So my call out would be to say that whatever piece of research we're doing, that we don't ignore that critical component of lived experience, because, as I say, suicide prevention is not a cookie cutter approach. It's not something where we can just say, take this down off the shelf. It's not linear. We need to understand people if we're going to understand suicide prevention.
Thank you, and thanks as well on behalf of my colleague Julie Herity, who I know would be very pleased to hear the call out about the research program that SPA is administering. Just a quick reminder again for people who've only just tuned in, you can ask questions or make comments throughout the next hour or so using the hashtag SPA Forum on the Slido app. Christine, we might segue now. It's actually a nice segue from research to data quality and evidence, because of course research, building an evidence base really hinges on strong research. We have a few questions around that, but I guess we'd really love a bit of an overview from you about the role of data evidence and quality in suicide prevention.
It's critical. It's critical. It's critical from two components. Firstly, data collection. Great believer that quality of data informs quality of decision making. So that is really critical. One of the challenges is, and I go back to some very early comments I made, if we measure our success or otherwise with suicide prevention by recording the numbers of those we lose to suicide, I believe we're too one-dimensional. So that comes not only with our approach, but also with our data collection. So we must, I believe, broaden our data collection. In conversations I've had with a number of you from the sector, it's a question of how far do you extend that to. So we would ideally like to be able to record really good data around attempts. Now, there's a lot of subjectivity involved in what is an attempt. So how do we try to get that a little bit more objective, or some consistency, some standards, because that will help us look not just in a particular area but across the system as to what is happening, and indeed what constitutes an attempt and what's the intersect with self-harm. Some really critical questions that I think we as a sector need to be engaged in trying to find those answers. So I think content of data is something we need to own. We also need to broaden our data collection to include those components which contribute to stress and distress. So one of the things that we are doing with the task force is working very closely with the AIHW, who has been commissioned along with the Mental Health Commission and the Department of Health to look at a monitoring system approach for data around suicide prevention. And I'm really pleased to say that in the 10 months of working with them, we've actually been able to broaden that project away from just a health kind of focus into a more whole of government focus. So that's the input side. The other side, which is really critical, the evidence side, is the evaluation. We really need to sharpen the lens on evaluating the effectiveness and the impact of our services and programs. And I know that's challenging, it's difficult, but we need to do that, we need to gather that evidence. And one observation I do make as I look across the landscape is that that is a significant area for improvement. And if we could but get some improvement in that space and some uniformity, some understanding of what we're looking for measures, some really good measures about what is an effective service or program, then we can start to really drive that whole approach forward.
Fantastic. I mean, again, it's music to our ears at Suicide Prevention Australia to hear about that rigorous outcomes-based approach, because also from some of the intelligence that we've gathered from the sector, we've noted that's a gap, the measuring of outcomes for the services and program delivered, which actually fosters innovation as well, doesn't it?
It does.
It means that we can actually change the way we do things. So,
and I think also goes back to that question of funding.
That's right.
Because you can then really drive your dollars towards what it is that you want. You can drive your service design to where you need to get to. So I think all of those things really help.
Well, I think you've anticipated a couple of the questions that we've had. We had a question from Mark Davis, one of our lived experience representatives, and Mark was really asking around what gaps you see in data, whether you were looking at attempts data, and you've answered that question, so thank you.
Yes.
Another question that we had, I think you partly answered as well. We have an anonymous question around social determinants, which I know is a topic that we're keenly concerned with in the sector at the moment. And that was just around, what do you see as the key social determinants of mental ill health and suicide risk that the task force might focus on? Is this sort of how big is it?
How big is it?
Yep.
So look, let me own what I think is the particular challenge here. The challenge is not understanding, identifying, talking about social determinants. I think that's locked and loaded. I think we know we need to go into that space. And social determinants include financial security, housing security, food security. It includes a sense of safety, you know, that I'm okay. So there's we need to address things such as trauma, you know. So we can probably list those. We can look at education, all of those issues. The real challenge is this: if we accept the premise that we can't just address any of those issues from a completely holistic perspective. Take housing, for instance. We know that housing security is really important. What we actually probably don't know is what are those housing distress components that are particularly pertinent in terms of looking through a suicide prevention lens. So if we take that broad approach, which is easier to do, which is we must address housing security, oh great, let's just have that conversation. When it boils down to, I need to go to the Prime Minister and say, this is the initiative around housing security that I really believe we must invest in because it will help reduce suicide, that's a much, much more difficult question. That's where we're trying to get ourselves down to. That's where the suicide model will hopefully inform us. They're the really hard conversations that we need to have. That's where I'd call on our researchers. I'd say, help. We need to better understand what are the specific touch points within the social determinant itself, which we need to target if we are going to try and reduce suicide.
So if we were talking, for example, about consumer debt, I guess if we're taking from the model that you're talking about there, we wouldn't be looking at how do we solve consumer debt once and for all, which is a big, almost wicked problem to solve. You'd be looking at what particular parts of someone getting, or touch points of someone getting into an over-indebted situation, do they need assistance, or what kind of person who's over-indebted needs assistance? Is that what
I think you, absolutely. So do we go into that playing field? Yep, we're right in the playing field. We're in the playing field of consumer debt. Then we're really saying to ourselves, as you say, it's not an efficient use of our resources and our opportunities to try and tackle how do we remove consumer debt.
Yes.
It is very much in our interests and very much what we are called to do, and but for us doing, others may not, to say what are those things we need to be looking out for in this particular playing field, which are warning flags for us that someone, some group may be at risk.
Yes.
That's the point. Not only should we, but we must intervene, and that's where we can do so in a much more targeted way than trying to solve broadly consumer debt.
That's right, those universal problems almost. We have some other questions. One of them is really timely because we're sitting a metre and a half apart, and we're doing this forum online when I think when we first...
COVID-19, yes.
Exactly, when we first talked about it, or when you first discussed it with Neves, our CEO, I think the intention was that we'd be getting our members inside a room. This question is really around the role of digital inclusiveness, and the question is, digital inclusiveness is important. This helps social connection, support and therapy, yet there is a digital divide. How do we close this? It's an anonymous question.
And can I say, this is a question that when I have been participating in COVID-19 work, which I have really effectively for the last few months, is becoming an increasingly not only common but urgent one for us to look at. People are very conscious of the fact that as we have pivoted towards telehealth, as we're pivoted towards online services, as we're pivoted toward the digital world, and in fact there are many positives around that. I had a meeting with carers yesterday, carers reps, who were explaining how this is actually bringing together people who could never have come together before. Let's celebrate that, but gosh, let's not forget those who either because they can't afford to be connected, they don't have access to the internet that we need, so they may live in rural, regional areas. They are not inclined to do it, you know, and we are a country of choice. How do we make sure that we don't leave people behind? So two answers to that. I think, firstly, at a time of necessity for physical distancing, with social connection, but physical distancing, we must do what we can to ensure that anybody and everybody has got some form of connection. So yes, we know we have our Telstra kind of service mandate that they must at least have a landline or some form of connection. But in discussions that we've had with the Communications Minister Office, I am pleased to know that service providers are doing COVID-19 very reasonable packages.
That's great.
I am really pleased that organisations such as Suncorp and others are working with the Smith family to ensure that we are trying to make access available to people who might otherwise be challenged. I am really heartened by hearing that people are in and of themselves purchasing phones and others to give to people who may not have it and are reaching out to help people connect. That's the short term of necessity. In the broader world that we will return to, and we will, where we have a much more mature digital response, we can never ever forget that it's not one-dimensional. We need digital, but we need face-to-face.
That's right.
We need people to come to us, we need to go to them. So we need a blended approach which best suits not only the person, but the particular stage or phase the person's in.
Do you think that this current, I guess, move toward digital that we're seeing is going to leave a lasting legacy on the way that we deliver services in the mental health and suicide prevention
I can't
space?
see that it couldn't. So that's a lot of negatives in there, but the answer is yes. I think it will, because I think that, look, let's face it, once you've flown to the moon, you know you can fly to the moon.
That's right.
So somebody telling you, no, you're not going to fly to the moon doesn't kind of really resonate for everybody. So once we have done it, I think it's a very big challenge as to how we manage that, and I think we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of thinking it's nirvana and suddenly we've got the best way forward. Yes, it increases reach, but there are many intricacies involved in getting it right. We know with our current system that there are challenges, so we need to ensure that as we expand into these areas that we do it properly.
We have quite a few questions coming in very rightly about lived experience, which I know incorporating lived experience, as you said, is really a paramount concern for you in your role as National Suicide Prevention Advisor. We have a question from Penny from Care for Life, and Penny would like to know what initiatives are in place to ensure people with lived experience are actively involved in suicide prevention work, for example, in upskilling and training. She was specifically talking about paid roles there.
Paid roles.
Yes.
Look, I can't fudge this one. I think there is a lot of work that we still need to do in Australia across the system to ensure that we are bringing our lived experience as peer workers into the place that not only they deserve to be, it's not so much that we need them to be. So we have a lot that needs to be done. So thank goodness for our peak organisations and others who are working with people with lived experience to bring them on board. Thank goodness for those services who are recognising and encouraging them to come on, but we have a long way to go. The other thing I guess that I hold near and dear about lived experience is that, again, it's not a simple thing. Lived experience for suicide prevention has so many different ways of manifesting itself. So being able to use our lived experience in a way that truly winds itself into the service that we're looking to deliver, the support we're looking to provide, that contributes to the outcome we're wanting to achieve is really critical. I firmly believe that includes full recognition, both in professional terms and remunerative terms for somebody who's contributing. But we do have a way to go.
That really does link with another question we've had around lived experience from Graham Holdsworth, who again is a member of our lived experience panel. And Graham's also an active member of my policy committee, so hello Graham, I know you've tuned in. Graham was really interested to know about whether you're actually working from a consistent or universal definition of lived experience, whether you're looking at a broad definition or a more, I guess, narrow view of what lived experience really is.
That's an interesting question. Lived experience of definition is broad. It's very broad. I think can I just refine that question just a little bit, Graham, because I think where my focus would be is to have this wonderful breadth of lived experience, to take an issue, a problem, a service design, whatever it may be specifically that I'm looking at, and to say what is the particular focus of lived experience that can best contribute to what I'm looking at. So if I'm looking at an issue of suicide attempts, what is the cohort in particular of lived experience I'd be looking at, and how do I want to best work with that lived experience to better understand the issue? So I think lived experience, and this is across mental health as well, it's almost too broad in and of itself just to say we're going to use lived experience. I think it is about, again, bringing that down a little bit more to what's the issue, who do I need to talk to, who do I need to work with, what is it that they should contribute, and but for that contribution we're not going to understand. That's where we then focus it down.
We have another question, not about lived experience and not necessarily about one of the priority themes that we earmarked for today, but an important one nevertheless, and that's about the results of the lifespan trials, which I know has been a key concern for you to really monitor and look at, and I think was a focus of the $64 million package announcement too.
There was a component in there.
That's right. So we have that question from Rayleigh Taylor. Rayleigh from the Care for Life Suicide Prevention Network wanted to hear from you about the results of the lifespan trials and how you're intending to use them.
Okay, Rayleigh, that is a really critical question because, as we say, we want to look at outcomes, we want to look at evaluations to see what we can learn from them. So lifespan has been used in, we've got 30 trial sites around Australia. I think it's been used in a number of those and certainly has informed many of them. One of this will be a roundabout answer to your question, but bear with me. One of the challenges that the task force and I found when we were looking at the fact we have 30 trial sites in Australia at the moment is actually there's no uniformity of evaluation. So it is actually quite challenging to dig deep into those trial sites to find answers to questions that are particularly important to us. And two questions that the task force and I are particularly interested in is, if you take the lifespan model, or if you take any other basis of evidence-based approach to interventions, is all of it necessary? Are parts of it absolutely critical and others more discretionary that can get shaped by circumstances? One question. Second question is, what are the attributes, resources that a community needs to be able to best able to take one of these, implement it and move it forward? So one of the things that came from the package was not only a continuation of some of those trials, but actually some dollars to see if we can do a meta-analysis, to see if we can bring together those results from those trial sites, to distill them down to see if we can find some of those common answers.
Our researchers will like to hear that.
So that again is a challenge.
Yes.
So in terms of the lifespan model itself, then I would encourage certainly to engage with Helen and her team at Black Dog and to best understand that. It's a fantastic model that has got some great things working in it. That overarching question of what across everything is going to have the most impact for the work we need to do, and through the lens of community application, we just need to do a little bit more work if we can.
Well, if we're talking about impact, we have a new anonymous question. Quite a lot of anonymous questions today, I have to say, rolling through. I think people might be nervous about seeing their names come up in the stream. Please don't be. Someone has asked about the role of safety and quality in, I guess, bolstering Australia's suicide prevention programs, and what role safety and quality might have in some of your decision making around investment. Any thoughts on that?
That's quite a broad and general one. Is it important? Again, yes, of course it is. I think so we know that any service program delivered through our health system is subject to very rigorous safety quality controls. That has to extend over anything we do. So I guess the challenge with this is that as we reach into a whole of government approach, and as we take it maybe into that broader application, and that may come out in terms of program services initiatives, how we make sure that an appropriate safety quality framework and requirements are placed around it.
Thanks, Christine. I'm just conscious we're coming up to 10:30 and there's a big topic for discussion today. It's probably something that's at the forefront of all of our minds at the moment, and that is COVID-19 and the response to it. Again, we're sitting, I think it's around 1.5 meters apart.
It looks about right.
Roughly, so
right.
I could measure that. We're sitting physically apart, obviously engaging socially. We've hopefully got quite a lot of our members tuning in but not able to be physically present in this room. And I know that we've already had quite a few questions come through from members about COVID-19, so we might pivot to that, area. And just quickly, if you have a live comment or question that you'd like to make about the COVID-19 response, or perhaps any emerging impacts, observations, feedback or innovation that you're experiencing with your organisation's response to COVID-19, please share. You can do that on Slido under the hashtag SPA Forum. Christine, perhaps a bit of a general question to kick this off around the government's COVID-19 response. You obviously played a big part in that with the announcement of the mental health components. What did that package look like, and what have you observed since you started rolling it out?
Yeah. So look, firstly, I think one of the things that was very heartwarming was the fact that Australia was a country that said early up there is going to be an impact of COVID-19 on Australians' mental health and wellbeing. And of course that also looks at underpinning that things such as suicide risk, etc. So that was great that we actually had an opportunity to go in first. One of the other things that was really, I think, quite strong about that package was that it was structured in a way that picked up that point I've just said, which is that it's almost impossible to go through something this seismic and not have it affect anybody's mental health and wellbeing. That doesn't mean we're mentally ill, it doesn't mean that we're in a crisis situation, but it does mean we need something there. So the fact that a specific coronavirus mental wellbeing support service was funded is there for all Australians, and recognising that it impacts across the whole spectrum of wellbeing. Then secondly, and I thought this was a really good approach to take was to say, actually, let's see if we can prevent things becoming worse for people. So rather than just waiting for crises to happen, what are those particular groups, the population groups that might be quite vulnerable, and what can we do for them? So we looked at our first responders. That was really, really critical. We looked at older Australians and the fact that how could we try and ensure that as we were physically distancing, we could still, through the community volunteers service, still make sure we reach people who are receiving aged care. We looked at our young people, particularly young people who were challenged by the fact that their last year of school was being interrupted, and all of the hopes and aspirations that go with that, just devastating, absolutely devastating. We looked at Indigenous people, we looked at new parents and expecting parents. So we looked at it through a number of different lenses in order to try and address those needs.
Very holistically.
And then we finally looked at, okay, how can we also have, if you like, a single source of truth? How can we improve our messaging and improve our access to resources to try and actually get this right for people? So that was the initial response of the government, and I think it was a good one. I think it was one which encouraged people to reach out, and I think that's what we're seeing. I think we are seeing that there are increased access to and use of our services, which is saying, if you're finding this tough, come forward and connect with us.
I think there's a very timely question again from James Bell at Wesley. Thank you, James. You've been an active contributor to the live stream today. I think that's really around, I mean, you've described what really was a very holistic package, tackling a number of key groups and really anticipating some of the groups that might be most affected by social physical distancing measures. And James was really wondering, I guess, what your considerations are around the compounding trauma of drought, bushfires and now COVID-19.
Oh,
so
yes.
You're involved in the bushfires response. It felt like you probably couldn't take a breath between that and this.
Yeah.
How do you feel that's
James, that is genuinely a concern. I mean, one of the challenges we have, of course, is that we know that there is a good evidence base to say that 3 to 6 months after a natural disaster, then you can expect a presentation, an increased presentation of mental illness and associated issues. So we have to expect that from our bushfires, from our drought and from our bushfires, that will get caught up in what we're looking at the moment. We're also looking at the fact that you've got trauma upon trauma happening for too many Australians. The drought was horrific, and I think that the longevity of that is something that almost, isn't it interesting how quickly it kind of fades into the background? But I can remember last year having the opportunity to travel around Central Australia and some of our more remote areas and seeing cracks in the ground that you just, like, it was just horrific what people have gone through with the drought. Then you put the bushfires on top of it, and those bushfires were the single most frightening thing that people have been through. It was kind of numbing when you spoke to people about it, and that was horrific. And the magnitude of those, you know, it wasn't just one jurisdiction, it was across Australia. And then we're taking a breath, we think that we're focusing in on that, then we get the COVID-19. And one of the particular inbuilt challenges there was we came out of the bushfires and heard palpably from people the single most important thing we need to do is to rebuild our communities, because when the chips were down we needed each other. We need to rebuild local community. If it wasn't there before, we need to create it. A few weeks later, distant from each other. Distant from each other. Don't get out there face to face. Don't hold those community activities. Don't build it. So that doesn't mean we don't need each other, but it means that this palpable yearning we had to make things different when we came out of the bushfires, to create, at every proposal had in it, how do we build local community, how do we come together? Suddenly we have COVID-19 driving us apart, and that's a very real issue we need to deal with.
Is your team, I guess, is the task force looking at gathering some intelligence around that? I mean, you've worked so closely with those bushfire affected communities, I imagine the lines of communication are very open? Or?
I think we're looking at it right across suicide prevention and mental health. I think that it's a whole of approach at the moment, and we're trying very much to be 2 ears, 2 eyes, 1 mouth, to really, I think, to understand. That's the other challenge, I think, with the COVID-19, is that with bushfires, with other natural disasters, they have happened before, and certainly the magnitude of our fires was beyond something we'd had before. But there is sufficient there to say, look, we think that we can legitimately expect some of these things to happen. Last pandemic, sure, we had the SARS in 2008, or 2003, but we have, that was not like this one.
No,
so,
I remember it.
Yes, it wasn't. So we're in uncharted territory.
That's right.
And one of the risks I think that we can fall into is making assumptions and doing too many responses based on our assumptions as distinct from what is actually happening. So one of our very real challenges, and we're certainly looking at this from a government perspective, is how can we gather information in real time, which may not have the robustness of some data we've collected in the past, but will be good indicators of what is happening and therefore how we shape our policy responses.
I think, look, the whole COVID-19 response is one that the entire sector wants to swing behind, and I can speak for Suicide Prevention Australia. We recently surveyed our membership, and I think every organisation that we work with was keen to collaborate with the government on this to ensure that our communities are not overly distressed, or that distress in our communities is minimised. We've just had an anonymous question that's really relevant to that point, which is, what are some of the key messages that you would like us in the sector to be sharing with the community to build resilience? How can we help you?
Thank you, and thank you for asking that question and for being willing to be involved. Look, I still fundamentally hold on to the fact that if we look at this through a suicide prevention lens, and I say that at that time where somebody has attempted or we've lost somebody to suicide, they have lost hope. So the single most important thing I think we can give to any human being is connection, which enables them to have a degree of hope. So I would call on all of us, notwithstanding the digital divide, notwithstanding our physical distancing, to be alert and look out. I go back to that paradigm shift that we called for in our initial findings, which I think is now probably more relevant than I ever thought it would be, which is look out for our fellow Aussies, look out, reach out. Don't make an assumption that people are okay. Don't intrude, but don't make an assumption that they're okay. And so I think that's the first thing we can do. The second thing I think we can do is to let people know that it's absolutely okay to not be okay. I started that kind of observation to myself back in the bushfires, and again I think it still holds, that we can't be going through everything we're going through and it's okay. It's kind of not okay. And even for those of us who have what we would call robust relationships at home, etc., we are living in confined arrangements which are going to grate on any and all of us, but they're also going to be pressure cookers for things to happen. So looking out for each other, reaching out and making a form of connection, being really alert are key things that we can do. Also just having that resource kit of being able to say, this is where you can go to somebody, you know, to let them know that if they need some help, they can reach out and there are services. I really think that's one of the best things we can do. I know it sounds simplistic, but I think that's the catch-all we need to be. We need to catch people at the moment and help them find the services they need.
We have quite a few questions coming through, I guess, linking with what you're just talking about,
Sure.
but our researchers are very keen to understand, I guess, around the role of evidence in building the response to COVID-19.
Yeah.
I think Martina McGrath here has asked an interesting question around what can we learn from research globally around global crises of any kind regarding strength-based and necessary protective factors. So, big question.
That's a really big question, isn't it?
Is there something that an experience we can draw from? Maybe not SARS, but...
Look, I think this is the challenge we are all having because we have looked out internationally. We are looking at what are we doing overseas, and if anybody has got something on this, please send it to us because we don't pretend to have a monopoly on understanding this or on being across everything we need to. I think the biggest challenge is the fact that there's a good evidence base for what builds resilience and resilient communities, etc. But what we're dealing with here is physical distancing like we haven't had before, which has got immediate and significant economic and social consequences for all of us. That's irrefutable.
That's right.
And so we have in the past, evidence around how do you deal with pandemics, how do you deal with SARS. We have evidence around how do you deal with economic downturns, the Depression, GFC. What we don't have is the intersect of those.
That's
and
right.
that's what
That
we're really
concern,
doing
yeah.
at the moment. So we need a very holistic approach. We need and a very nuanced approach. One of the things that I think is really, really critical that we are learning here is that for Australia to not only get through this, but to come out the other side, probably the key focal partner, and partner assumes a few of us together, but the key focal partner is our community. Our communities are going to get us through this because our communities need to get on board, understand, adopt. And I think Australia's been fantastic in how it's responded. I think the fact that we have relatively low numbers, and I wish we hadn't lost anybody, but we have, but relatively low numbers compared to the rest of the world means we are doing it okay. But we have such a long way to go. The bit about our immediate survival, we're doing. The bit about how we emerge from this and re-enter back into a thriving life is more challenging because it won't be the same. There'll be components which will, but it won't be the same. So this is a time for us to do it. So I'd call on our researchers, in fact, to say this is the time for real-time social research. This is the time to be inquisitive and for us to try and build an evidence base that we can draw on.
And can I invite any researchers who are watching right now, please feel free to write to me and the team after this if you'd like us to follow up any additional questions, or perhaps if you do have some research that we'd like to pass on to, that you'd like us to pass on to Christine and her team at the task force. Just going back, I guess, to that compounding, the compounding issues being experienced by people in those drought and bushfire affected communities. We have a question from Shona at Stand Tall Australia. Thank you, Shona. And she's asking, how do we reach students and families in bushfire and drought affected areas that don't have access to data or Wi-Fi when we're stuck in a digital world? I mean, this is a broader question around policy, around access and so on. What are your thoughts on
that? So look, how do we reach them? Big challenge, particularly if we can't do it at a time of physical distancing. So if you'd asked me that question 8 to 10 weeks ago for the bushfire areas, I would have said, we are hitting the ground. We are going out. We are taking an approach which says we're going into communities. If that needs to be door knocking, we'll go and door knock. We will reach into. We can't do that now. So, so the answer now has to be a little bit different. And I come back to, I guess, what I said before, which is local people know local people. So this is a time for us to step up in that local space. That doesn't mean we need to be able to provide the answers. But it means that we might be able to identify those who need some assistance, need some support, and try and connect them through. So there has been an increase in amping up, if you like, of resources that can respond to people in need across the spectrum. The key thing is to connect need to those resources. That's where I have to call on our local communities. Go back, as we said, to local councils, etc. We will have to somehow work through those linkages.
We have a comment from Karen Phillips at Standby again, and Karen has just wanted to offer that the latent impact can be years and years later, therefore planning needs to be long term. I mean, the next phase of your work is really looking at how we can engage in long term thinking around suicide prevention. With the COVID-19 response, are you doing some long term planning as well?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I think it's now becoming part of the common parlance, and this is good, part of the common parlance that we will get through the physical and probably the economic faster than we will through the mental health impact of this one. Gosh, I go back, Rebecca, and I remember I'm of a generation that had older relatives who'd gone through the Great Depression. Now, by the time they died, it was decades since the Great Depression, but to the day they died, they still talked about it. They still had some behaviours which were impacted by it. I hope that's not the case for here. I hope that we now are at a point where we can identify some of those challenges and try and avoid that being a consequence. But this isn't something that's over in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. We will be seeing some tail end effect. This not for everybody, but we do know that for many Australians, the impact of this is going to be life-changing and it can be long-term. So we do need to actually incorporate that. In fact, we must incorporate that in our policy and service responses.
Brilliant. I mean, I know that would be a relief to many. I'm sure that a short-term approach for a problem of this magnitude wouldn't be something that yourself or other government leaders would be considering. But I mean, another question has come in that I think hits similar touch points, which is from Richard Brimble at Lifeline. Thank you, Richard. Richard is asking, as we focus on emerging from COVID-19, should we expect any policy settings that will address likely challenges regarding unemployment and suicide risks? This is a difficult question.
Okay, so it's the intersect. I'm hearing there the intersect between unemployment and suicide risk.
That's right.
We know it's there, don't we? We know there's irrefutable evidence that is one of the touch points we must address. So one of the things that we are working on with the government at the moment, and I think this goes a little bit towards that, is to say there is a general recognition across the portfolios that we need to identify points of distress. So we will have Australians who would never have envisaged receiving any form of government support.
That's right.
Who will be for the first time in their lives making touch points with Centrelink that they never thought would happen to them. Take our assertive outreach approach. We can't just ignore that is particularly challenging. There must be something we look at doing in that space. So we know some of those touch points. We can't ignore them. I'm also genuinely concerned for our older Australians, and so we need to look at those with quite a specific lens.
Thank you. And you've just anticipated another question, which was around whether you're going to have a focus on seniors and not just young people. And I think you've answered that a couple of times. Karen McColl, who is a very active member again of a couple of our committees. Karen works within the Premier's Office for Suicide Prevention in South Australia. Thank you, Karen. Karen has wanted to ask a question here about what are your thoughts about our duty of care and outreach support for mental health and wellbeing for those in mandatory isolation. So this is a group who are obviously experiencing the sharpest effects of physical distancing. How are we looking at supporting
Are we talking
them?
here about people who might be in quarantine,
That's
etc.?
right, with
and
the,
what
in
do we
hotels
need?
and so on.
In hotels, etc. Yep, and we were talking about this just last week and looking at how can we ensure the most holistic of responses we can do. Again, we must go through that assertive outreach. As we were commenting, people in mandatory isolation are a finite group. We can reach them. We know who they are. So I think making that initial touch point is really critical. And I think that's not just providing somebody with some pamphlet saying this is information. There is no substitute for the human voice. I think reaching out and being able to make a phone call, make a contact to say, you might find this challenging. If you do, we're here, is important. Providing access to resources. We can't change some of those challenges. I mean, can you imagine being in a hotel room, even with your loved ones? You know,
that's right. It's a recipe
there's closeness and there's closeness and there is closeness.
That's right.
So it is. You just have to accept that, and there are some things you can't change about it. So you build the supports around it. You build in the checking bits, and you do what you can to hold those people as they go through. And do we have a duty of care? As human beings, we certainly do. If we know somebody is going to be going through that kind of challenging time, then all of us, I think, are beholden to say, what can we do?
I imagine it's a similar issue with the seniors over 70 who really are. I mean, they're not in mandatory isolation, but they are isolating themselves by and large. And I imagine they're experiencing similar struggles.
Older Australians, it's really challenging. I think not only are there's the physical isolation, some of them have been amazing about the taking up digital technology. You know, forget this is for the youngies, you know, we were just sort of saying this is quite amazing what they can do. But there's also quite a shift in terms of a number of our older people now being instructed by their children as to what they can and can't do. And that, I'm having increasing conversation around that. And what does that do in terms of the dynamics in a family?
Relationships.
And in terms of relationships. So there's new things we're experiencing here that we need to address.
We have another question. I imagine this is something that you are certainly looking at, from Joe Kalea. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Joe. Joe was expressing the fact that there have been some offers of support from overseas lived experience experts in response to the impact of physical distancing. Is this worth exploring? Joe, I'll be taking some details to pass on to Christine and the team, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with those offers that have been made.
So look, I think it's a case of saying, looking at all offers and saying what is it that we can learn from, putting it through the lens of each country, as you look around the world, has got different challenges and different responses to COVID-19. So it's how we actually make that the best fit that we can, and looking at any offer from a genuine lens.
Great. Look, everyone loves the question of intergovernmental collaboration, which is a passion area for me, but I didn't know that it was also a passion area for other people. Odd passions, I think. We have a question from Michaela, and Michaela was really asking around how you're working with local and state governments in the COVID-19 response, specifically for mental health and wellbeing.
Okay, really good question again. So let's take the example that's been set by a national cabinet. And I think our national cabinet has been a key component of us being able to have a response in Australia that has been an Australian response. So you've heard me use the word national. I tend to go to national rather than talking about Commonwealth and states, because I think national is bringing it all together along with locals. Are we working with them? Yes, we are. We are. One of the issues we're looking at this week, in fact, is to see if we can reach some interjurisdictional agreement on what are the key priority areas that we are now facing. So we've been through the first wave. We have had the Commonwealth response. We've had some state-based responses, including a recent one from Victoria with quite a significant package for mental health and for suicide prevention. So we are trying to ensure we're on the same page in saying what are those priorities. And once you identify a priority, then you can better identify what levers does the Commonwealth have, what levers do the states and jurisdictions have, and indeed local government.
Thank you. Look, I have you as a captive guest today, Christine, so I might actually ask you a question of my own, and it's one that I'm sure there's a very positive response to. I guess I'm curious around, my background's in business policy primarily, and I'm interested in the discussions that the task force might be having with business groups, industry groups, and how we might be working with employers to provide some of that support to their workforces during a really challenging time.
So thank you again for that. So within the Commission works with what's called the Mentally Healthy Workplace Alliance, which is a bringing together of a number of employers and employer representative groups.
Including the Chamber, which is
including
great.
Including the Chamber and including BCA and ACTU, Superfriend, Beyond Blue, others are in there as well, Australian Industry Group. So we have that grouping that we are looking at. And we are looking, I guess, through two lenses at the moment. The everyday work that we are looking at within the Alliance that happened pre-COVID-19 was what we're calling a National Workplace Initiative to really better position mentally healthy workplace initiatives in the workplace. We're looking at it through that lens, but over and above that, we're also looking at it to say, what are some of the common denominators that are impacting upon employers, business places, workplaces, and how can we potentially address those? Again, though, we need to be careful in those spaces because, so firstly, I should say this, I can assure you that each of the Alliance members are totally 200% focused on what can they do for their employees. I think that's a universal, which has been good to see. Second thing then is what are some of those common things we can look at? So one of the most common denominators, of course, is the challenges of working from home.
That's right.
And that wonderful blend, because let's call it, between our paid and our non-paid work, our family obligations and our work day job obligations, and how we kind of make those work and what are the tensions, particularly for those who have children who may need to engage in schooling. And how do you do all of that in that particular mix? But then, as our ACTU rep said to us, don't forget that only applies to X number, I think it's about 30% of workplaces. There are many, many workplaces where you can't work from home. So then again, what are the challenges for that? So is it needed for responses to be done for COVID-19 through workplaces? Tick that box. But again, we need to make sure that it's appropriately nuanced to the workplace that's being addressed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for answering my personal question, Christine. I'm just wondering, before we go to Neva's for some closing remarks, whether you had some final thoughts for our members, for the sector, things that we should be, maybe some tips and tricks around how we should be working at the moment during this very new way of working, very new situation that we're seeing with COVID-19.
Thank you. Well, look, there's no better place, I think, for me to go to than the work that was actually done by our colleagues within the sector. So we have a campaign that I think you're familiar with called #InThisTogether.
Yes.
And that was the work of so many people from our sector who all came together to say what are the evidence-based tips for what we can do, and really they come down to things like recognise the challenges of where you are, create for yourself a new routine. I love the one, create a new routine for yourself, because I think one of the challenges we're going through is a sense of loss of control, that this is being done to us, we can't choose it. Reclaim that space, make your own routine is something I would say. Stay connected with people, and don't forget, and this is probably the most important one, don't forget the human connection point of communication. This is not about communicating with people so much, this is about connecting. And connecting means forget the texting, forget the typing, do the FaceTime, do the Skype, do the Zoom, make it real so you can see people. And apart from that, I just want to do a real call out to the wonderful things so many people are doing in their communities. And I love the Aussie spirit. Have you seen the dress up for midnight? That kind of thing. So us good old Aussie humour that can keep things going. But really, and I mean this seriously, that you'll find that within your community, within your family group, there are really good ways that you are addressing the challenges. Hold on to that and share it with us, because there are rich lessons for all of us to learn out of that.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, for being so generous with your time and insights today. I'm not sure whether we'll all dress up for midnight, but we certainly should be sharing the hashtag You Can Talk. Thanks again for your time today. We've really appreciated it. And now
thanks to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And our Chief Executive Officer, Nevis Murray, will wrap up.
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, I suppose it's never more important for the sector to come together than at a time like this, where we've had compounded and protracted distress across the country. And I'd like to thank Christine on your behalf for making time to have a discussion with us today about very important issues that she's looking at from a suicide prevention perspective, but also in relation to the current distress that our community has felt. So thank you very much, Christine, for making yourself available and for your generosity today. Thank you, of course, to our members. We had over 100 members attending this session today from around the country, over 70 organisations represented, and a very large majority of people identifying as having had a lived experience. That's a huge representation. Thank you very much for your questions. They have shaped today's event, and certainly I hope that you got a lot out of listening to Christine's responses. So what happens next? For those colleagues that weren't able to join us today, we'll be putting together a video of today's event so that you'll be able to share that forum, the forum that we had today, with your colleagues. We'll also be gathering insights from today as an important input into our own commentary to the work that Christine and the task force are doing to inform the Prime Minister for future initiatives. I hope that this will be one of the first of many platforms where we can engage with you for continued consultation and input into the work and guiding the work that Suicide Prevention Australia does. As the peak body for the sector, it's important that you have your say and that we take your voice and amplify your voice to the people who can make a difference and certainly change policies, make systemic changes that will move towards an Australia with reduced suicide. So thanks again for your involvement in today's discussion. If there's anything that you felt wasn't addressed or a particular question that you had, please forward it to the team at Suicide Prevention Australia, and we will do our utmost to respond to you as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you.